Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending and coming, and I want to thank the host for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to be here for the first time and talk to this distinguished audience. I was asked to reflect on the secular dimensions of Israel, which is a very vast topic and definitely would make for a whole course or series of lectures, and I will try and condense it into several issues and topics which all deserve much more elaboration, I have to admit. It's each issue or each chapter in this theme that I would like to reflect upon, I think deserves a much wider explanation and analysis. But I hope to complement some of the issues by your questions and your comments, so to see which of the issues which I just start to explore deserve, at least in your mind, further extrapolation and expansion. I'm an historian by profession, so my main interest would be at the origins of secularism in Israel. But if I will have time, depends on my pace of talking, how tired I am, and how energetic I will be. I will try and say something about Israel since 1948 and secularism, and even if I have more time, I will reflect about the future, which is anyway a bad idea, so I don't mind if I don't get there, and we can leave that for the discussion. It's enough to predict the past, there's no need to predict the future. But I really do believe, because I'm a professional historian, but I'm also an activist, that much of what one sees in any phenomenon and in any attempt to understand a phenomenon, in this case, what is secularism in Israel, one learns a lot by focusing on the formative years of the origins of a phenomenon. This is true about the situation in Israel and Palestine in general. I don't think that you can really understand what motivates people, what causes people to act the way that they act, what blocks certain options from developing. A lot of it has to do with the formative years of the situation. In brackets, I would say, one of the easiest way of explaining why the so-called peace process in place since the 1970s, on the case of Israel and Palestine, why it is such a failed and futile attempt and waste of time and energy, is exactly because it refuses to take the core issues of the conflict as a departure point for solving it. It insists, almost like a physician, to continue and talk about the symptoms of the problem because it feels uneasy of dealing with the origin of the disease. And I think some of that reflection on the general reflection on the peace process will also come into my reflection on the issue I was asked to talk about. I'm trying to be disciplined. This is Germany, but I'm not a very disciplined person, so I do apologize beforehand. There is a way in summarizing the topic in one sentence, actually. The relationship between Zionism and secularism. I'm sure some of you heard me say it before. I'm not even sure I originated this statement. Probably heard it from someone, but I can't remember who, which is convenient because then everybody thinks that I invented that, which I think it's a good sentence. The connection between Zionism and secularism is very much the opposite of the connection between Zionism and God. Most Zionists don't believe that God exists, but they do believe that He promised them Palestine. I think that gives you a very clear notion of how Zionism and God interplay in the last 120 years. In the academic world, there are four paradigms competing that try to locate the Zionist movement within this question, or within this axis of ideas between religion, if you want, on the one hand, and secularism on the other. The kind of juxtaposition of notions such as religion and secularism, of course, has all kinds of other similar juxtapositions. It could be modernity versus tradition. It could be the West versus the rest. It could be the developing world versus the developed world. Secularism, as you know, as an academic concept, is very much a part of the theory of modernization. The whole idea that a certain historical development in Europe improved human society, and the improvement included, among other things, separation of church and state, secularization. It's not the only feature of modernization, but it's a very important feature of the project of modernization in its theoretical abstraction. And when modernization was, in a way, exported outside of Europe, it's like with a magic wand. Anybody who came in contact with the wand, the magic wand of modernization, became modernized in different paces, with different successes, and some people rejected modernization and became anti-modernization. Now, if you were not secular, it meant that you were anti-modernization. Secularism, for some reason, reflected your ability to become modern. It should have gone together with liberalism, democracy, and other features of political, social, and moral life, but somewhere in the 1960s and the 1970s, the big theorists of modernization conceded that it's a bit more of a modular kind of process. China today can be secular, but not liberal and not democratic, and yet to undergo the process of modernization, for instance. So it doesn't have to go, secularism is not an assured formula for whatever one thinks about modernization, and maybe Turkey is a good example for moving out of secularism and becoming even more modern in many ways. So there are some big questions mark about these very dogmatic, static assumptions about modernization and the place of secularism inside these modernizations. And I think this whole debate, this general debate about modernization as kind of an overall theory that explains to us the major changes in the history of the world in the last 200 years, within that debate comes also the debate about how to understand Zionism and its relationship to secularism. So as I said, there are four paradigms, I think, that characterize the academic, intellectual, theorist, if you want, debate on Zionism, and like everything else connected to Israel, Palestine, and Zionism, it's never purely academic, thank God. It's never purely theoretical. It has an activist side to it. It has an ideological side to it. It has a political side to it. The division is between those who admit that there is a political and ideological side to this and those who do not. The division is not between those who are neutral and unbiased scientific about it and those who are. There isn't such a division. That's a fabrication. What you have is either people who are aware or admit this kind of uneasy relationship between activism, ideology, if you want, and scientific research on the one hand, and those who feel that they somehow succeeded in excluding themselves from external influences on their work. The first paradigm is the one that you can still hear and read about in the mainstream Israeli academia. This is still the leading paradigm within the Israeli academia, I would say. Zionism is a secular movement because it is one of the most successful examples of the project of modernization altogether. I mean, that's the belief. That's the contention. The contention is that the whole project of Zionism was part of the whole project of modernization. And whereas there are quite a few unsuccessful examples of that project, Zionism is one successful project. And therefore, its success is also manifested in the way it dealt with the issue of tradition, religion, and secularism. One of the leading Israeli historians of Zionism, Yosef Goni, or Yossi Goni, G-O-R-N-Y, you can read in his book how he begins the book about Zionism with this declaration. I'm not quoting it verbatim, but it's more or less what he says. This is a great success of modernity. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting assumption that doesn't have to be easily contradicted, because much of how you decide to engage with that statement depends on your view about modernization and modernity. If you feel very strongly about modernity as being this successful human progress, but you feel very uneasy about Zionism and Israel, of course, then you would like to challenge it and to say this is not a modern project or not a successful project of modernity. But if you are uneasy about the project of modernity or Westernization altogether, you may agree with Professor Goni and says, yes, you are maybe a successful case study, but that doesn't mean that this is good, that this is positive. So much of it depends on our basic assumptions when we engage with such a paradigm. I'll come back to that paradigm in a moment. The second paradigm is much more, I would say, esoteric and yet very interesting. And it had to do with the work of few people inside Israel and outside Israel who were not particularly informed in a theoretical world, but nonetheless created a theoretical model, I think, without even being aware of it. They did not approach the issue because they had a theoretical background or position. They were actually concrete researcher on the ground, but out of their work you can understand how they feel about the relation between secularism and religion in the case of Israel. And a very good example, and I'm sure you've heard the name of this, is Israel Shachak, the late Israel Shachak, a professor of chemistry who was an activist, the president of the Israeli League of Human Rights, someone who already in the early 50s criticized the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians and the Arabs from within, and was quite a lonely voice before others joined him in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. I don't know if you heard the name, but he wrote several books on the topic. And at the time, his book looked, as I said, very esoteric, very kind of out of the mainstream. I think people are rereading his books now because a lot of what's happening on the ground gives a lot of credence to what he wrote. It happens in history when someone is sort of coming a bit too early with ideas that sound quite queer and strange, and then with time you come back. His idea is, and that's a very touchy subject, and I think that's one of the reasons not many people followed him. He looked at Zionism as an aberration of Judaism. In other words, what Yosef Goni or the mainstream Zionist academia in Israel would see as a successful implementation of the project of modernization, he would see as, first of all, an internal development within Jewish history, much more isolated from the development of modernization, and he would see it as a reduction of a very rich, a very comprehensive value system that was condensed, that was sort of squeezed into a kit of tools in order to implement a political project. And that in the process, he claimed, like in any other religion, because a religion is a sea of possibilities, of interpretation, of viewing the world, the things that were chosen out of the huge reservoir of Jewish religion and tradition were the worst aspects of Judaism. He claimed every religion can be treated in such a way. You can politicize any monotheistic, and not just monotheistic religion. You can politicize a religion if you want to employ it for the sake of a political project. And then what you get is a kind of an abuse of the religion itself, not just a project which is valued as negative or positive. And in one of his books on Jewish religion, he tried to show, in almost an academic way, although it was much more intuitive, but it doesn't matter, it's still a very interesting work to read, which precepts of Judaism were used in order to justify the takeover of Palestine, the mistreatment of Palestinians throughout the years until the time he wrote his book. So that's a paradigm that you can see it now coming back. It comes back because there are a kind of a multifarious ways of expressing your Judaism in the modern world in the 21st century, and people are coming back to this relationship between Zionism and Judaism. And history is important because then you remember how the Jewish Orthodox world received Zionism when it just appeared. You know, you remember probably the stories of the Zionist leaders going to the big rabbis of the day trying to get blessing for the idea, and they were totally rejected as sacrilegious and so on. So that's another paradigm. I would say that the appropriate sort of academic paradigm for this is between theology and political science, if there is such a thing. So maybe sociology of religion is the right term for this. A third paradigm is the one that wants to fuse together the project of Zionism from a religious point of view and locate it within not just one religion, Judaism, but within two religions. Protestant Christianity and Judaism. The last example of this approach is, maybe you've heard of Shlomo Zand's book, The Invention of the Jewish People. Don't know if it was, I'm sure it was translated to German.
Yes,
it was. But he's the last one in a series of people who were looking into it. And that is a very interesting topic, which can be dealt within the two sides of the chronology. The very, very beginning of Zionism and Zionism today. Not just as a Jewish project, but as an evangelical Protestant project. And it has two sides to it. It has an historical side and it has a current side. This idea of Zionism as being not just a Jewish project, in fact being much more of a Protestant project than a Jewish project. I'm not sure it will go well in Israel if you try to sort of discuss it openly. But I think it's very important to discuss it. I think it tells you a lot about what happened and happens. In the first side of the paradigm, the origins, you have a sort of a pre-Zionist Christian Protestant movement, even before the Jews of Europe think about Zionism as a solution to their problem. Around the 1820s, before any Zionist text appears as a Jewish text, you have Zionism appearing as an evangelical text. I'm sure you understand the connection. On both sides of the Atlantic, you have something which is called Christian Zionism in the early 19th century. You have people who believe that the return of the Jews to Palestine is part of the divine scheme that will include the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and apocalyptic kind of vision in which the return of the Jews would be an indicator, very important indicator, that the world is reaching that particular moment from an evangelical Protestant point of view. Now, it was not just a Protestant point of view by itself. It seems from the research, and this research has to be continued, it's very important to continue this research, shows that at the moment of decision making in the Zionist movement, the very end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where some people who were very central in the Zionist movement realized that their noble desire to save the Jews of Europe and to reinvent, if you want, Judaism as a national movement, they realized that these two projects, if you want to implement them in Palestine, you will run into trouble because there are already people living on the land. And because of that, other options were surveyed at the time, as you probably know. The most known of that is Uganda, which was the most serious one from a Zionist point of view. But not only Uganda, Argentina, Azerbaijan, a very nice, I just saw it the other day, a nice island near Niagara Falls. And there were other places. And it turns out that, especially in Britain, Protestant circles exerted strong pressure on the Zionist movement not to give up on Palestine, because they wanted to see the divine scheme being implemented there. So that's the historical issue. It's very interesting to look at Zionism as an evangelical project. It would make it life much more interesting and would explain a lot what happens today. Now, of course, the other side of the chronological spectrum is the impossible and yet very strong alliance between Christian Zionists in the United States, and not only in the United States, in Europe as well, and the Zionist movement. I say impossible because Christian Zionism developed in the last 100 years, and at least its vision for the Jews in the final scheme is very clear nowadays. It wasn't clear maybe 100 years ago, but now it's very clear that in this final kind of scenario that they have, when the Messiah would come for the second time and the resurrection of the dead, the Jews will have to convert to Christianity or be shish kebab in hell. Now, why do you want to have an alliance with people who regard you as food for their picnic? They don't want to invite you for the food, they want to regard you as food for the picnic, is beyond my comprehension, but politics has seen stranger alliances coming into effect. But I think it brings back, in a very weird way, alliances that current Israel, with its inability to sustain international legitimacy, would have to keep, because what else would be left? I know it can still rely on Germany, but this also will change, I promise you. So they will have to, apart from Germany and Austria and Christian Zionists, they will have serious problems in finding serious allies in justifying their policies and even the nature of the state. Now, the last and very interesting paradigm for judging Zionists' connection with secularism and religion is the paradigm of settler colonialism. You are all familiar, I'm sure, with the paradigm of colonialism. The paradigm of colonialism is very historical. It's a very closed paradigm. In other words, when you talk about colonialist projects, you usually imagine something that is already behind you. There's a certain period, there is a certain genre of literature that is connected to it, and there is a certain narrative which we are all familiar with. There's colonialism, there's anti-colonialism, there's liberation, and there's also post-colonialism and neo-colonialism, as we know. Settler colonialism was, in a way, invented as a paradigm, and you know, I don't know if you know, but there's already 2-3 journals of settler colonialist studies, because a certain colonialist project did not really end. They just substituted the old colonialist means of exploiting the native people with different kind of methods, sometimes masquerading as democracies even, and so on. I'm not sure how valid or invalid this paradigm is. It doesn't matter for me for this talk. What matters to me is that it produced some very interesting works. The last one I'm thinking of is by a colleague of mine from the University of California, from UCLA, by the name of Gabi Peterberg, a book called The Returns of Zionism, where he analyzes Zionism today as a settler colonialist project. Settler colonialist project means, in many ways, an ongoing struggle to take over a land from its indigenous native population without succeeding in completing the project. And therefore, you have the conflict. If you want, coming back to what I said about the peace process. For instance, the peace process since the 1970s refuses to adopt this paradigm because the Israelis would object, of course, to be viewed as a settler colonialist movement, and therefore they would not allow the peace process, for instance, to be a process of decolonization, as it was in South Africa. So and in many ways, if the process in Israel and Palestine is not about decolonization, there will not be peace and not be reconciliation in this respect. Anything else is just a waste of time and energy, as we have, I don't have to say this is very clear. But for our talk tonight, what is so magnetic about settler colonialist paradigms is that it doesn't really matter whether the ideology motivating the settlers, motivating the colonization of the place, is religious or secular. It sees actually the debate about Zionism, whether it is a religious movement or a secular movement, is very secondary. Because, as you probably know, colonialists can even be, and we know it from the case of Palestine, can be communists as well. From the colonized perspective, if the colonizer has a boot on the colonized face, and whether he holds the Quran, the Bible, or Karl Marx, usually to the colonized it doesn't matter. Because what matters is the boot, not the book that is holding in the hand. The Israeli Communist Party, it took them 55 years to understand that if they come and colonize under the name of Marxism, and someone else comes and colonizes under the name of the Bible, from the Palestinian perspective, this is not a particularly interesting debate. And I think that's for me, the great value of settler colonialist paradigm, that it puts the focus on the oppression, on the dispossession, on the colonization as an act, and is far less interested in the ideological origins of that oppression. Because, and that's also typical to settler colonialist literature, some of the motivation, some of the impulses that moved people to settle in someone else's land are quite humane, are quite noble, are quite understandable. People were actually victims. And through the process of settler colonialism became victimizers. So the process, and this you can read in the post-colonialist literature, the process of the victims becoming victimizers is something that we learn from the settler colonialist paradigm, and there the question of the real nature of Zionism in terms of religion and secularism become less important. Between those four paradigms, I think what we come up with is the following, that, and we may have I hope we have enough time to have a proper debate. Yeah, we may have a good discussion here about it. I think that there is a media hype, sometimes there is also an academic hype, about religion and secularism in Israel as central issues. I don't think they are. They're really not. I mean, that's my own take out of these four paradigms. That's what I'm taking from there. I really think the issue, or the basic condition, that informs the realities is the colonialist condition, not the condition of religion versus religion. I don't think the conflict is between Islam and Judaism, or between Islam and Christianity and Judaism. In Palestine, I'm talking. I don't think so. I know there's a vast literature that insists that this is the nature of the conflict. It became very popular after 9/11 to portray the conflict in Palestine as a conflict, a religious conflict. I don't agree. I don't think it is a religious conflict. I think it's a conflict between settlers and people who don't want to be settled or colonized. Secondly, I do agree, and I think that's an interesting story, which does not inform the general condition of the situation in Israel and Palestine, that any religious movement that tried to reinvent itself in the late 19th century as a national secular movement has created problems which are insoluble. Are not easy. Secular Christianity, secular Judaism, secular Islam, even from the language, from the linguistic perspective, sound quite bizarre. In reality, it's even worse. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that much. Of course, it works on a daily basis, because people are, I remember I was a member of the Israeli Communist Party, and I always remember that in Ramadan, during the Politburo discussion, we lost the Muslim members of the Politburo because they went to pray in the Israeli Communist Party. So I know that people know how to navigate between religion and even the most religious secularism in place. It's possible. On an individual basis, there is no limit to how you can settle contradictions. You can be a secular religious person. You can be anything you want. I mean, you can be two genders at one go if you want, or three even, I understand. So there's no limit on a personal level to what you want. I'm talking about injecting these personal solutions into social systems, into cultural systems, into political systems, if that's possible. Or you need a different kind of paradigm which creates a different kind of dialogue between religious and not religious people, secular and not secular people. So on this basis, on a more general basis of the relationship between secular and religious groups, there is an internal Jewish issue here, which in Israel we used to call it as a problem, who is a Jew, which is a famous kind of a debate that continues to affect Israeli life. But if you connect, and that's an issue of secularism versus tradition. That's a question on the general public sphere, whether there is a possibility to reinvent Judaism as ethnicity or as a national group. And when you reinvent it as nationalism and ethnicity, it becomes secular. It doesn't remain a religious phenomenon. But if you tie in the internal, very interesting and very intriguing Jewish debate inside Israel, of who they are because of the historical circumstances that brought them into Palestine and developed them as a distinct Jewish groups, if you want, different from other Jewish groups. But if you tie it in to the settler colonialist situation, you come back to my metaphor of the colonizer having the boot on the face of the colonized. This internal debate is not only irrelevant in one way to the general situation in Israel and Palestine, it even is employed and exploited to make the situation worse. What do I mean by this? From a religious perspective, as you know, like in any collective identity, and religion, like nationalism, like any kind of attempt to define ourselves on an individual basis, is a question of collective identity. And we know that we know who we are by knowing who we are not. I know I'm a Christian because I know I'm not Jewish and I'm not Muslims. It would be very difficult to know that I'm a Christian if there were not the other wasn't there, right? So for Jews to know that they were Jews was very easy. They were in Europe or in the Arab world, depends where they were. So they were either not Christians or not Muslims. And both the two other religions actually also defined very well the relationship between the two religions in the two cases respectively. But when Judaism reinvented itself, planted itself in Palestine, and grew up as an ethnic Jewish group in Palestine, the question of who was a Jew from this perspective, a Jew is someone who is not an Arab. Which is very interesting because a lot of the Jews are Arabs, as you know. In 1951, Israel began to import 1 million Arabs who were Jews. And this was a great problem for the Zionist movement, that moment, because the basic self-image of secular Zionism in Israel, the basic image was, as I said, the project of modernity, which included secularism, democracy, but more than anything else, included a Western image. You were part of Europe. Forget about the geography, doesn't matter. Although geographically you are located in the Arab world, in the midst of the Muslim world, you are not there. It's an optical illusion. You're actually in Europe. If you just cross the street, you are in Berlin. Definitely my mother thought so, because she came from here, that if you cross the street on Mount Carmel, you get to Berlin. And she never saw anything else in Asia around her. Now, coming back to the real issue, the identity of the Arab Jews was an issue, and the only way of resolving it, as some of the great critical works produced in Israel in recent years have shown, by Ella Shohat, Yehuda Shenav, Sami Shalom Shitri, to mention but few of these Israeli Arab Jews, Israel had to de-Arabize these Jews. How do you de-Arabize Arabs? You ask them to get rid of their Arabic accent. You ask them to get rid of their Arab names. You ask them to get rid of their Arab behavior. But most important than anything else, in order to be accepted as modern people, they have to show antagonism towards Arabs. And that was very well exploited by the right wing in Israel, which was anti-Arab, a European anti-Arab ideological movement. They exploited it very well in 1977, because they had no chance of getting to power in Israel, which was controlled by the Socialist Labour Party. But they understood very well that all these Jews who came from North Africa and Iraq and other places understood that the ticket for normality in Israeli society was to display very strong anti-Arab feelings. So the Likud exploited it to win the elections in 1977. So you de-Arabize the Arab Jews because the new definition of a Jew is someone who is not an Arab. And much of the secular energy in Israel, in the legal frame, in the educational realm, in the political reality, was directed, still is directed, in creating Jewish exclusivity. You can do it by having a semi-apartheid state that gives rights only to Jews and not to Arabs. You can do it by creating gated communities of Jews. There are many, many ways. In fact, you become so hysterical at one point that you bring Christians as long as they're not Arabs. These are all the Jews who came from the ex-Soviet Union, and I see them every Sunday praying in the Orthodox Church next to my house. This was very important in order to re-Judaize Israel. You can be a Christian, that's okay, as long as you're not Arab. Now, and it's a successful project, unfortunately. It is a successful project. Although I do think it's thin. I believe it can be cracked, and I'll say something very, very shortly about it. The very tragic issue was that in order for the internal issue, the unresolved issue of religion and secularism within the Jewish community, in order to make it possible to survive in the public realm, this almost impossible idea of a secular Jew. Again, the only thing you could do in order to make it stick, because it's not logic, it cannot work really, was to cement it with the anti-Arab position. Namely, what we see in Israel is a movement led by rabbis mainly from Arab origin, who have turned the secular and liberal, very sophisticated way of excluding the Arabs into a religious precept, into a religious dogma. So you come back to Israel Shachak. That's why people reread Israel Shachak. They found a way of turning the Bible, the Halakha, the Jewish religion as the main justification for racism towards the Arabs in Israel, which is very different. I'll give you just one example. I have another 5 minutes?
Yes.
5 minutes and enough. I'll give you a very good example which will illustrate the difference. Again, I'm coming back to the point that I'm not tired. I'm tired, but I'm not tired to repeat again and again that from the colonized, oppressed point of view, it didn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But it does matter from the oppressor's point of view. The liberal secular way of excluding Jews is very typical in Israel in using the discourse of the army service. If you don't want to employ an Arab waiter, you don't want to employ an Arab worker, you say that you are looking for people after the military service. This is a known code in Israel for not employing Arabs. What the rabbis do, they don't use liberal secular discourse. They say, we are not employing Arabs because we are religious Orthodox Jews. So we are not employing Arabs. An Arab shouldn't be employed according to our religious understanding. Now, you would have thought that this would embarrass the liberal Zionist secular camp. On one level it does. On one level it does. And there is a kind of a contra attempt by liberal Zionist NGOs, non-personalities, political parties, to try and block it. It's very unpleasant to hear your own hidden racist ideas being articulated so clearly, right? But on the other hand, they're not totally against it, because in practice, they also don't want, as the author A.B. Yoshua said, to live in proximity to Arabs. But they cover it with a different discourse, the discourse of modernity. So it's not really a cultural war about the attitude toward the Arabs. It is a cultural war about what Tel Aviv is allowed to do at night or not to do at night. This is, this is now used actually by the defenders of Israel as the main, probably the last, ammunition against the war of legitimization. I don't know if you've read the article in the New York Times, how gay rights in Israel are now what women's rights used to be in the colonialist period. In the colonialist period, women, feminist activists were recruited by a colonialist movement to justify colonizing areas in order to bring equality to women. Exactly. Now the same is being done with gay rights in Israel. And there was a very critical and good article about it in the New York Times. I don't remember who was the name of the writer, but if you look for it, you will find it. So the issue of secularism is now in many ways downsized, and with this I will end. It's downsized in Israel into a struggle on the nature of the gated community, not the core issue. Not the core issue, on the gated community. And therefore, it's a very virtual, irrelevant, to my mind, kind of discussion. It's not irrelevant to the people who are involved in it, of course. They take it very seriously. But it is irrelevant because, for instance, it's not connected at all to a very alive and important and an ongoing discussion in the Arab world about tradition and modernity, about secularism and religion. This the Israelis will never allow themselves to be involved in, on multiculturalism in the Arab world. That's why they fear the Arab Spring, so-called. They fear it because this is the wake-up call that would make them understand that they are in the Middle East and not in Europe, for good or for worse, for good or for worse. And I think that the whole issue, to sum it up, I would say that the future of Israel is sort of lying there between two paradigms that both are very difficult to digest. And probably they're not worth much, because this is I want to end on a futuristic sentence. Don't take it too seriously, because nobody knows what's going to happen. But it gives you kind of a look, you locate yourself, I think, in a discussion when you do this. The one possibility is to integrate the issue of religion and secularism, modernity and tradition into the area's agenda. You become part of the area's problems, you become part of the area's solutions. Whatever history will take the area to. You cannot be different. Again, I don't know, I hope it will be resolved nicely or not, I don't know. But you have to be part of it or go away. There's nothing for you to do there if you're not interested in it, right? Now, if you do that, you have to change the regime in Israel. You cannot remain a Jewish, ethnic, racist state and claim that you are the only democracy in the Middle East. That doesn't work. So you have to collapse in a way, which nobody does voluntarily, nobody likes to do, nobody likes to give up privileges, but it may happen anyway, whether you like it or not. It can happen to you anyway. Or you do it voluntarily, as halfly was done in South Africa. You can have, there is a model of sort of disarming yourself from a racist ideology by yourself. Not, of course, because you wanted to, but because you, at the right historical moment, you say, I can't maintain it anymore. So I'm building another regime with all the risks and all the problems that it brings. It's not an assured, successful formula. The other one, which I'm afraid is more likely to happen, at least in the near future, is you give up the project of modernity game, because it doesn't work. The world doesn't buy it anymore, so you're not a paragon of modernity. Apart from some Christian Zionists, I don't think anyone in the right mind, when they will ask us BA students to write, give us good examples of where liberal democracies are particularly successful, my guess is that Israel will not be among the first 55. But I may be wrong, I don't know. So that doesn't work anymore. So you don't use it anymore as an excuse. It's not an ammunition. You use anti-Semitism. That's always better. You accuse everyone of anti-Semitism, and you ally yourself to those who want to barbecue you in hell, the Christian Zionists, and you hope that somewhere between a paranoia from anti-Semitism and crazy Christian Zionists who can even have a president in the White House, you'll be secure on top of 250 nuclear weapons. It's not a great idea for security. I wouldn't sell it as an insurance agent, but somehow it works with some progressive, open-minded Jews and Germans. I don't know why. I have my own suspicions why it does. Now, instead of that, you'll have a very tough ethnic identity of Israel. We can see the new legislation in the Israeli parliament pushing towards that, where secularism and religion would find an easy common language because the anti-Arab nature would become so explicit. Would this include a compromise between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, namely Tel Aviv being the paragon of secularism, Jerusalem the paragon of religiosity? I don't know, maybe it will work. Maybe it will work for a while. I don't think this is something either the Palestinians will tolerate. I don't think this is something the Arab world will tolerate. I'm sure this is something the Muslim world will not tolerate. And maybe even the West at one point will stop tolerating. And then we'll have to go back to the first model, but after a lot of people have suffered. So I hope there are shortcuts in history. I'm not sure about it, but I think I'll end here. Thank you.